Can we make a week's worth of food in 3 hours? Today, we're going to make week 1 of Amanda's fall section from the Food52 A New Way to Dinner cookbook. The recipes we're making include chocolate olive oil cake,
butternut squash puree,
the tomato base for a cream of roasted tomato soup,
braised fennel with fronds,
egg salad,
pan roasted chicken,
beef short ribs in red wine,
and finally, a lemon dressing to use throughout the week.
Let's get started.
The first thing we did was salt the chicken. Doing this ahead of time really does make the chicken taste better and the skin crispier.
Then we preheated the oven and got started on the cake. We lined the cake pan and then made the batter by whisking together the dry ingredients and the wet ingredients separately. We were very tempted to add some orange zest to the cake batter to go along with the orange juice, but ultimately decided to stick to the book. Then we combined everything together and folded in the melted chocolate before putting it in the oven.
While she puts together the cake, I started prep for the short ribs. We started off by chopping the onions and carrots and then seasoned the ribs with salt and pepper.
With the cake now in the oven, I started searing the ribs.
While I started on the base for the cream of tomato soup. The recipe called for corned tomatoes. I wasn't sure how much to take out and if we should remove the seeds. If you've made this recipe before or cream of tomato soup, let us know what you do in the comments. We ended up keeping the seeds, which was likely a mistake in hindsight. We oiled and salted the cut tomatoes and prepped for roasting.
Since the cake needed a little bit more time in the oven, we switched gears back to the short ribs. We sauteed the pancetta and then added in the chopped veggies. While the recipe called for pancetta, if we made it again, we would likely substitute bacon. We usually have bacon on hand, and bacon's cheaper and was already used in other recipes for this week. We had to check the cake a few more times, but it was finally finished right as we were finishing up with the short ribs. We pulled the cake out of the oven and then topped the short ribs with the tomatoes, red wine, and seasoning. The recipe didn't clearly state whether to leave the lid on the short ribs or not, but we assumed we needed to leave it on to help with the temperature and moisture retention for the long simmer.
The cook is intended for 3 hours of active cook time for one person, but with 2 of us, a baby, and filming, we were not at all on track. At this point, we turned the oven up to get the temperature for the tomatoes and then took a break to feed ourselves, our son, and then reconsider if we wanted to really do all of this today.
Also, we didn't have a plan for lunch, and we still had a lot of cooking in front of us, so we ended up eating some frozen pizza. Now that everyone was fed and the baby was contentedly napping, we started up again by throwing the tomatoes in the oven.
While the tomatoes roasted, we started on the butternut squash puree, dicing up the squash.
We ended up only needing 1 squash, even though the recipe called for 2 because we had a really giant one. We probably could have got this on the burner faster, but the sous chef wanted to get a shot like this, so when that was done, the timer had gone off for the tomatoes.
The cookbook gave us the option to mash the tomatoes, which was preferred, or to pulse in the food processor, and we love our food processor, so we decided to take that route. It was easier to do, but created more dishes, and it's not the preferred option because it has the risk of being too watery. Now that that was done, it was time to get back to the squash, which was steaming in its own water along with a little bit of oil and salt.
At this point, we had 2.5 burners occupied, and it was starting to get too crowded to start on the braised fennel.
But eventually the squash softened and was ready to mash. I was skeptical of the method of steaming the squash in the Dutch oven to soften, but it mashed fairly easily with a hand masher, and the bottom did not burn.
Then we waited for the fennel to be done and tossed the fronds in before returning the squash back to the heat so that we could add the cream. Now we're back to 2 Dutch ovens on the stove.
At this point, we had dishes everywhere, so we took a break to pack up some of the food items we've already made, clean the kitchen a little bit, and get things back into order.
With that out of the way, we started making the hard-boiled eggs for the salad.
The cookbook mentions to go 6 minutes past simmer to hard boil the eggs, but we found that 10 minutes typically works better. Although in this case, I thought I set a timer for the eggs.
There are no timers set.
I didn't set a timer for the eggs, it turns out. And so I had to guess how long I cooked it, and ultimately that was wrong. So these are the hazards of relying on Echo for the cooking times. So I had to start another set of eggs because the yolks were still gooey.
Then we went ahead and started on the pan-roasted chicken. This is a recipe we've done before, but never in these quantities. To do the amount for all of the meals, we needed a lot of burner space, and with the short ribs done, we finally had enough room where they would fit.
The short ribs were not actually done, but we'll come back to that later.
So we pulled out both our cast iron skillets and started heating the oil and preheating the oven. Prior to this review, this was probably our favorite recipe from this cookbook, and probably still is. It turns out great every time, it's simple and easy to riff on. Normally, we'll prep vegetables to roast during the pan searing and then throw the sheet pan in at the same time with the chicken at the end, so it all comes together at the same time in an even 30 minutes. Then, while everything roasts, we clean the dishes and make the salad.
Typically, we don't make chicken for meal prep. We cook it right when we're going to eat it. And when we do have leftovers, we end up microwaving them. And so it'll be interesting to see, using the oven method, if it actually makes that much of a difference for the reheat. Partway through the cook, the second round of eggs finished and were actually cooked through this time. However, I was pretty beat and decided that I was going to make the egg salad another day.
Then we moved the chicken to the oven.
While I pulled the short ribs earlier, I never did actually check for salt and if they were tender.
So when I checked, they weren't quite tender enough yet. So those went back on the stove to try to get to that nice falling off the bone consistency. However, I didn't check for salt either at this point, and it ultimately turned out we undersalted. The recipe said 2.5 to 3 hours, but we ended up leaving it on for closer to 3.5 hours to get to that falling off the bone stage, and we could maybe have even gone a little longer.
Then we made a very simple dressing for the salads throughout the week. The recipe called for agave syrup, but I think honey would have worked just as well. Otherwise, it consisted of mostly kitchen staples. We tend to over-rely on the salad kits, so we were pleasantly surprised with how little effort there was to actually make the dressing.
All in all, we spent close to a total of 5 hours cooking. We were excited about everything at first, but by about 2.5 hours in, we started to lose resolve. And some of the mistakes we made with undersalting, with not getting the meat tender enough the first time around, with the eggs, were probably due to that tiredness kicking in. Also, only one of us read the full recipe playbook ahead of time.
So because I didn't read before, when she stepped away, I had to catch up and figure out where we were at in the game plan. Also, because we drifted on the game plan timeline, we got out of sequence on kitchen equipment, which ultimately added further delays with large pots needed for big batches, burner space was at a premium, and recipes requiring different oven temperatures overall. We also made a fair amount of dirty dishes along the way and needed to do a dishwasher load throughout the cook.
It also turned out that the cook time for the short ribs and the cake took a little bit longer than the recipes called for. Now, this could have been due to variations in the oven temperature on our end, but we ended up needing an extra 10 minutes on the cake and a little over 30 minutes more for the short ribs.
Overall, while we did not succeed in prepping in 3 hours, I think if you are focused, you plan ahead, you've read the recipes prior to starting, it's doable, but probably plan for 4 hours still.
There are probably some things we could have done to make it go faster too, like buying pre-chopped vegetables or skipping some of the steps.
That being said, the recipe does give options for ways that you can reduce the cook time by subbing out some of the recipes. So like the short ribs can be subbed for grilled lamb chops or things like that. And so there are ways to still use the cookbook as intended, but sub out some different recipes to make it a little bit more manageable.
That being said, I think it would still be a pretty intense 3 or 4 hours, even if you were 100% prepared. Now we'll see if all the time and effort paid off in part 2, where we see how everything tasted and if it really saved us time throughout the week to front end all our meal prepping.